November 1965, Leningrad, Main Intelligence Directorate. Deep beneath the dreary gray of the streets, in a windowless bunker, the cold reigned. The air was heavy, saturated with the ingrained scent of tobacco and the dry, acrid burn of ozone emanating from the incandescent teletypes. The only sun in this subterranean world was the dead amber glow of screens, where numbers and graphs sprang to life. Here, in this hermetic world, the Soviet Union viewed the world not through the murky lens of ideology, but through the cold, crystal-clear objective of mathematics. At the center of the room, on a massive steel table, rested the trophies, a reel of magnetic tape and a stack of grainy, high-contrast photographs. They had been delivered by diplomatic pouch from the trawler Vega. Officially, the vessel was engaged in tuna fishing in the North Atlantic. In reality, the Vega hunted far more valuable prey. The electronic pulses originating from the American test range at Cape Canaveral. Those gathered around the table were neither politicians nor party functionaries. They were titans, ballistics experts, rocket engineers, radar geniuses. The very men whose intellect had lifted the R-7 rocket into space and placed Sputnik into orbit. They knew everything about thrust, atmospheric drag, specific impulse, and the relentless tyranny of gravity. They were certain they knew the limits of the possible, but what lay before them silently screamed to the contrary. The senior analyst, a man in thick glasses, hunched under the weight of his knowledge, extended a trembling finger toward a telemetry printout, a jagged line traced by a stylus on a paper ribbon. Here, his voice was a barely audible strained whisper, is the launch signature. We register ignition, a standard solid fuel discharge. His fingers slid an inch to the right, and here, the signal is lost. The general standing opposite him frowned, his massive shoulders heaving forward as he loomed over the table. Lost? Are you saying the radar failed? Did the Americans jam it? No, Comrade General. The analyst shook his head, his eyes fixed on the graph. What I mean is, the object moved so rapidly that it left our radar's coverage area between two pulses. The scan repeats every 2 seconds. At 1 second, it's on the launch pad. At the 3rd second, it's already at an altitude of 3 kilometers. By the 5th second, it's vanished over the radio horizon. In the ensuing silence, only the clatter of the teletypes became deafening. The general slowly picked up the sheet, staring at the ink lines, as if trying to will them into a rational form. That implies an acceleration of, he began, calculating in his head, then faltered as the numbers bordered on delirium. 100 G, the analyst quietly supplied. Perhaps more. 100 times the force of gravity. The general slammed the paper back onto the table. Impossible, he snapped. It's an equipment malfunction, a phantom signal. His voice boomed in the confined space. At 100 Gs, the electronics would be pulverized. The fuel grain would fracture and detonate. The airframe itself would disintegrate. No known material could withstand that. We thought the same, the analyst replied calmly, a bottomless fatigue in his voice. That's why we waited. We waited for the Vega to send visual confirmation. He picked up the top photograph from the stack. The image was blurry, taken from the deck of a ship rolling in the sea through miles of atmosphere. A white, unnaturally straight contrail pierced the sky from the very horizon. But the second photo made the blood of everyone present run cold. In it, captured in a split second of focus, was the object itself. A simple cone, a perfect geometric shape, but it was glowing. And this was not the orange flame of a rocket nozzle. This was the blinding, incineratingly white light of a star. Its entire skin was aglow. "It's on fire," the general breathed, desperately clinging to a life raft of logical explanation. "An accident. It's about to explode." "It is not exploding, Comrade General," the analyst corrected him grimly, his words sounding like a death sentence. "It is flying, and that glow is ionized plasma, the result of atmospheric friction. It is moving so fast and so low that the very air around it is turning to fire. What we are looking at is a meteor flying in reverse, from Earth into space. It is a meteor flying in reverse." There was no room for contemplation in the silence that followed, the room filled with a cold, primal fear. The entire Soviet military doctrine, the very foundation of their superpower status, rested on one simple, unbreakable equation. The Western Republic had better bombers. They had a better navy. But the Eastern Union had them. Massive, inescapable rockets. The strategic rocket forces were the true shield and sword of the Smolny. If war broke out, Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, would cross the Atlantic in a fiery arc and rain down on America's cities. There was no defense against them. Gravity was the perfect courier of death. Once a warhead began its descent from space, nothing in the world could catch it. But if the Americans had created something that could accelerate to 100 G, if they had forged a bullet that could catch another bullet falling from the edge of the sky, the general said, his eyes locked on the glowing white cone in the photograph, his words a final verdict. Panic did not erupt in screams. In the Soviet system, it was too dangerous. It smelled of weakness. Instead, a cold, cloying, bureaucratic terror crept through the echoing corridors of the defense center. The report from the Vega was classified and assigned the highest priority code name. Sysword, meaning was reserved for phenomena that defied scientific understanding itself. For weeks, the finest minds of the Union tried to exorcise the white ghost with logic. "It's a trick," they insisted, "an optical illusion caused by a new type of radar reflector. A calibration error on the Vega. The laws of physics are the same for everyone," was the refrain at meetings. "The Americans are bound by the same periodic table, the same merciless thermodynamics, and the same material strength limits as the Eastern Union. To build a rocket capable of withstanding the heat of Mach 10 at sea level would require materials that simply do not exist in the universe. Aluminum flows at 660 degrees Celsius. Steel loses its structure at just 500. Titanium ignites like a matchstick if accelerated too fast in an oxygen-rich atmosphere. If this object was real, it was moving at a speed where its skin temperature would exceed 2,000 degrees in seconds. It would be hotter than the heart of a blast furnace. "The Americans are strong in chemistry," one of the lead engineers from OKB-1 remarked with a wry smile at an emergency meeting. "But they are not magicians. You cannot command metal to ignore fire." But the reports kept coming, like hammer blows against the armor of denial. From listening stations in Mexico, intercepting radio chatter from Texas. From deep-sea hydrophones scattered across the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. And the picture repeated itself, time and again. A flash of a launch, instantly vanishing from radar. Then, a deafening sonic boom, shattering windows long before the roar of the launch itself reached the ground. The Americans were testing something, and they were doing it with terrifying persistence. By the winter of 1966, denying the obvious became impossible. The Soviet leadership was forced to face a monstrous truth. the Americans had solved the problem of interception. To grasp the full scale of the catastrophe, one must understand the cold, ruthless mathematics of nuclear war. A Soviet warhead approaching its target travels at Mach 23, leaving a thin trail of ionized air. Intercepting it with another missile is a task often compared to hitting a bullet with a bullet. But the reality is even more complex. It's like hitting a bullet with a bullet in pitch darkness, while the target bullet is also deploying decoys to confuse you. The Soviet answer to this problem, the quote system, was as crude and desperate as a sledgehammer. They built lumbering monsters with giant nuclear warheads. Their plan? To detonate a nuclear weapon in space, blindly hoping that the all-pervading radiation and shock wave would incinerate the American missile. It was clumsy. It blinded their own radars. It was a shield forged from pure desperation. It was a shield of desperation, assembled from outdated technology and a few scattered radars. The new American weapon was something else entirely. The telemetry data pointed to a point defense system, not designed for detonation in the void of space. It was built to erupt from the ground at the last possible moment, as the enemy warhead was already screaming toward its target, and destroy it either with a kinetic impact of incredible precision or a compact, focused neutron warhead. This meant the Americans weren't just building a shield, they were forging impenetrable armor. If they could surround their missile silos, the capital, and command bunkers with these white ghosts, the Soviets' first strike would falter before reaching its targets. And if a Soviet strike was doomed to fail, the Americans would gain the freedom to initiate a nuclear war whenever they pleased, confident in their immunity to retaliation. The fragile balance of mutually assured destruction had collapsed. The Americans had killed it with speed. A special committee was immediately formed in the Smolny. The task was brutally simple. Find out what it is, find out how it flies, and find out how to destroy it. The KGB was put on high alert. Operatives in Austin and Chicago received new, stark orders. Forget the politicians. Ignore troop movements. Find the engineers. Find who is buying exotic alloys, who is ordering impossible quantities of solid rocket fuel. The hunt for the quote 43 had begun. But the Soviet scientists, locked in their cold design bureaus, staring at equations of drag and heat transfer scrawled on blackboards, felt a knot of icy terror tighten within them. They were hunting for a weapon that could not exist, a rocket that could turn itself into a blinding streak of white lightning. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. The Americans hadn't just built a new missile. They had kicked open a door to a new era of physics, leaving the Eastern Union locked in the past. Leningrad, KGB Directorate N, Winter 1967. The investigation into the White Ghost increasingly resembled not a detective story, but a medieval witch hunt. In the Eastern Union, falling behind technologically was not seen as a failure of imagination, but as criminal negligence. If the Americans had a weapon the Smolny didn't know about, it meant someone in the intelligence apparatus had failed to steal the blueprints in time. And in '67, under the stern gaze of General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, failure meant a disgraceful end to a career, and sometimes to a life. Directorate T, the KGB division responsible for scientific and technical espionage, was turned inside out. Its officers faced a single impossible task: explain the monstrous acceleration. The file on the anomaly swelled, stuffed with reports from agents embedded in American aerospace giants, transcripts of intercepted conversations from Arizona, and radar data from fishing trawlers on duty in the North Atlantic. But the data only confused, contradicting itself. It painted a portrait not of a missile, but of an elusive phantom. The investigation was led by Colonel Ivan Morozov, a man who approached espionage with the skepticism of a civil engineer. He sat in his cramped, sound-paneled office, staring intently at a blackboard covered in chalk formulas. "It doesn't fit any known missile profile," Morozov muttered hoarsely to his aide without turning around. He forcefully jabbed a piece of chalk at the board, underlining an equation. "Look at the fuel density requirements. To achieve 100 Gs of acceleration, the missile would have to burn fuel at a rate that is theoretically impossible. The pressure inside the casing would spike to 50,000 pounds per square inch." He paused, running a hand over his weary face. "A steel casing would burst like a child's balloon. The nozzle would vaporize in a fraction of a second." Morozov turned and pointed to a fresh report from a listening post on the Kola Peninsula lying on his desk. And yet, they launched them again and again. The investigation shifted from the realm of theory to the plane of desperation. The Soviets began looking for a trick, a deception. They latched onto the idea that the Americans were staging a masterful piece of theater, a grand hoax. One theory that gained popularity in the GRU proposed that the White Ghost was actually a directed energy weapon. The logic was seductive. Seductive because it was the only explanation that didn't force them to admit they had fallen hopelessly behind. The logic was deceptively simple and alluring. The glowing cone in the photos was not a superheated object at all, but a bolt of plasma generated by a powerful ground-based laser or microwave emitter. This explained the impossible acceleration. Light has no mass, and a beam can move almost instantaneously. It also explained the blinding glow, and why the radars suddenly went blind. The ionized air simply scattered their signals. Quote one general dismissed at a briefing. To confirm this theory once and for all, the Soviets took extreme measures. They altered the orbits of their most sensitive spy satellites, burning precious fuel to pass them as low as possible over the Atlantic test ranges. Their target? Giant laser emitters. The colossal power plants needed to feed such a beam. But the satellites returned only images ringing with emptiness. There was nothing of the sort at Cape Canaveral. No giant mirrors, only unremarkable concrete silo lids scattered forlornly among the scrub brush. And then came the debris, evidence that shattered the elegant laser theory. A Soviet submarine, risking detection, crept close to the splashdown zone after another test and managed to retrieve several fragments floating on the ocean's surface. It was a meager haul, just a few pieces of charred composite bobbing on the waves. But it was matter. It was real. When the fragments arrived in Leningrad, they left the metallurgists utterly baffled. The material had a blackened honeycomb structure. It smelled of burnt resin. It felt like charcoal to the touch, yet it was harder than steel. "This is no laser," Morozov concluded, carefully lifting a piece of the scorched material with tongs. His voice was muffled. "This is a heat shield, but it has nothing in common with the protection on our cosmonauts' capsules. Those are designed to withstand atmospheric entry for minutes. This He gently traced the charred surface with the tip of his instrument. This was born to endure a true hell. For just a few seconds. The investigation hit another dead end, but from a different direction. If it was a physical missile capable of surviving such heat, how was it controlled? Thus was born the paradox of blindness. Soviet physicists knew full well, when an object travels through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds exceeding Mach 5, air friction creates a plasma sheath around it. And plasma, an ionized gas, completely blocks all radio waves. This is precisely why spacecraft experience a period of radio silence upon re-entry. They can neither send nor receive signals. But an interceptor missile desperately needs to receive commands, to know where the enemy warhead is, to make course corrections in fractions of a second. If the white ghost is traveling at Mach 10 in the atmosphere, it's enveloped in a plasma cocoon so dense that no radio signal can penetrate it. It's deaf, dumb, and blind. A radar specialist nearly shouted at Morozov, throwing his hands up in despair. The Americans launch it, and it immediately loses contact with the ground. It can't see the target. It can't hear guidance commands. It's a bullet fired into absolute darkness. And yet, the American test data screamed the opposite. Radars impassively recorded the missile executing breathtaking maneuvers at monstrous G-forces to hit its target. How? And so, paranoia began to fill the void left by logic. Soviet scientists started to entertain the most incredible possibilities. What if the Americans had discovered entirely new laws of physics? Perhaps they were using neutrino beams, gravitational waves, or, and this thought was blood-chilling, had they created an autonomous artificial intelligence, a mind small enough to fit in the nose cone of a missile, capable of seeing and thinking for itself, without a single command from the ground. In 1968, the investigation took another, more sinister turn. The KGB began to suspect that the white ghost was something far more than just a defensive weapon. After all, the logic of the Cold War is a game of mirrors. You look at your enemy and know he will do to you what you would do to him. And the Soviet Union was, at that very time, experimenting with nuclear rocket engines. Engines that used a series of small nuclear explosions to achieve unimaginable acceleration. 100 G, 0 to Mach 10 in mere seconds. Only a nuclear explosion could provide such an impulse. This thought, like a chilling whisper, spread through the corridors of the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna. The idea of using a series of atomic blasts to propel a rocket was not new. The Soviets themselves had once abandoned it. Dirty, radioactive, uncontrollable. But the theory took on a terrifying shape. The Americans, it now seemed, had gone through with it. Their white ghost was riding a wave of tiny nuclear detonations into the sky. This meant something unthinkable. Every interceptor launch was accompanied by a series of atomic explosions directly in the atmosphere. They were willing to poison their own air just to stop a Soviet attack. This painted a portrait of an enemy not just technologically sophisticated, but maniacally, insanely dangerous. They are building a weapon that uses the apocalypse as fuel, read the report that landed on the Politburo's desk. The walls seemed to be closing in on the Soviet leadership. Their own missiles, the mighty R-36 intercontinental giants, had suddenly become slow, lumbering dinosaurs. What good was a 20-megaton warhead if a tiny, white-hot American demon could leap from the earth and swat it from the sky before it was even armed? This desperation spilled over into the industry. The Soviet Minister of Defense slammed his fist on the table at a meeting with his chief designers. His voice thundered. The chief designer, a man who had dedicated his life to creating weapons capable of destroying America, slowly raised his head, but his gaze was fixed, not on the minister, but on his own hands, resting on the table. He said quietly but clearly, "The investigation was at a standstill. They knew the missile existed. They knew what it could do, but they could not replicate it. It was as if they were watching a magic trick, and no matter how many times they slowed down the film, they could not see the strings." Morozov, exhausted and cornered by deadlines, made a final, fateful recommendation. He wrote in his final report, "They had backed the Eastern Bloc into a strategic corner. But while the Kremlin had nightmares of nuclear engines and laser beams, the truth was hidden in a secure hangar in Houston, Texas. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't nuclear explosions. It was a triumph of chemistry, weaving, and raw engineering might. A triumph that proved to be far more incredible than any Soviet theory. While Leningrad was chasing ghosts, the Americans were literally weaving the future. Houston, Texas, Martin Marietta Aerospace Division, 1968. While Colonel Morozov and the KGB were chasing phantoms of nuclear engines and alien lasers, the truth lay on a drafting table in a sun-drenched Texas office. It wasn't magic, it was a cone. A simple 30-foot cone named Sprint. And the men who created it looked nothing like omnipotent sorcerers. They looked like accountants in short-sleeved shirts and narrow ties. But they faced what was perhaps the most audacious engineering challenge in the history of ballistics. To catch a bullet with a needle, while the needle itself was on fire. All of the Soviet confusion stemmed from one fundamental mistake. Moscow assumed the Americans were building a conventional missile, just an impossibly fast one. But they weren't. The engineers at Martin Marietta, working under the Army's Anti-Ballistic Missile Command, realized that the laws of standard physics wouldn't work. They were too slow. To save an American city from a Soviet warhead re-entering the atmosphere, they didn't need a missile. They needed a controlled catastrophe. The task sounded like madness: to create a controlled catastrophe. The answer to this challenge was Sprint. It was the heart of the Sentinel program, and later Safeguard, and almost everything the Soviet Union thought about it was wrong. Soviet intelligence was right about only one thing. Conventional rocket fuel burns unacceptably slowly. To make a missile accelerate at 100 G, to have it leap off the launch pad and reach Mach 10 in seconds, you couldn't wait for a flame to leisurely creep through a fuel grain. The solution, devised by engineers at Hercules for Sprint's first stage, was brilliant in its brutality. They didn't create a rocket engine in the traditional sense. They built a casing and packed it with a propellant that was chemically closer to a powerful plastic explosive than anything else. But the real magic was in the geometry of the burn. In a normal rocket, the fuel burns from one end to the other, like a cigarette. In Sprint, however, a hollow, star-shaped channel was cut through the center of the fuel grain. At the moment of ignition, the entire inner surface of this star-shaped core ignited simultaneously, burning from the inside out. The fuel didn't so much burn as detonate in slow motion. The pressure inside instantly skyrocketed to an unimaginable thousands of pounds per square inch. The thrust wasn't just ferocious, it was apocalyptic. The missile didn't lift off the launch pad, it vaporized from it. This furious power created a new paradoxical problem. The launch itself would destroy its own silo. The exhaust was so hot and the pressure so monstrous that launching from within a concrete well would simply collapse the entire bunker. So the American engineers devised a cold launch system. Sprint's engine did not ignite in the silo. Instead, a powerful gas piston shot the missile out like a cork from a champagne bottle. For one unbearable instant, the missile hung in the air, cold, dead, silent. And in the next split second, the engine roared to life. Observers at the Nevada test site described it not as a launch, but as a magic trick. One moment, a missile is hovering above the silo. The next, it's gone. Only a deafening thunderclap that knocked the wind out of their lungs remained. But the main puzzle for the Soviets, the one that gave birth to the White Ghost legend, was the heat. How could you fly at Mach 10 near the ground and not turn into a drop of molten metal? At such speeds, air friction becomes a cutting torch. Air molecules simply don't have time to get out of the way. They compress in front of the nose cone into a plasma sheath where the temperature exceeds 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than an oxyacetylene torch cutting through steel. Aluminum vaporizes under these conditions. Steel loses all its strength. Soviet theorists were convinced the Americans had discovered a new, unearthly element. They were wrong. The Americans hadn't discovered a new element, but a new weave. The engineers turned to a material called quartz phenolic. It was a composite, layers of ultrafine quartz fabric impregnated with phenolic resin, essentially an advanced form of fiberglass. But it had one unique, almost sacrificial property. It was designed to die. This was the principle of ablation. As Sprint tore through the atmosphere, the outer layers of its skin did not try to resist the fire. They embraced it, absorbed it, charred and vaporized, peeling away from the airframe. By turning from a solid into a gas, this material carried the destructive heat away with it, protecting everything underneath. Like a mythical creature, Sprint shed its own burning skin to survive. And the blindingly white light that Soviet satellites saw in the photos wasn't paint. It was the white-hot, dying heat shield. And inside this inferno, separated by just a few inches of insulation, the fragile electronics operated in the blissful cool of room temperature, completely unaware of the blaze raging outside. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that drove KGB analysts mad, was guidance. How can a missile see its target while flying through a blinding plasma cocoon? The answer was brilliant in its audacity. It couldn't. The Sprint missile was blind. It had no eyes or ears, no camera or radar in its nose cone. It was a command-guided weapon. The brain of the operation was not in the missile, but on the ground. A missile site radar, MSR, a colossal pyramid-shaped structure resembling a temple to some futuristic, merciless religion, did all the work. A futuristic temple with a silicon heart did all the work. The MSR's phased array antenna locked its invisible gaze on both the incoming Soviet warhead and the ascending Sprint missile simultaneously. At the same time, a massive computer center, one of the most powerful on the planet, calculated the deadly dance of interception in real time. It computed the single point in space and time where the two bullets flying toward each other had to collide. But one seemingly unsolvable problem remained: the plasma. The white-hot ionized air enveloping Sprint completely blocked all radio signals. The Americans solved this problem with primitive fury. The MSR transmitted guidance commands to the missile using a microwave signal of such monstrous power that it literally burned a hole through the plasma cocoon. Moreover, the brilliant engineers placed the missile's antennas at its tail. They looked backward, toward the ground radar, through a small plasma-free window in the wake of the airflow. It was an engineering ballet, a miracle of precision choreography on the edge of impossibility. The ground computer had to guide a missile traveling at 3 kilometers per second to hit a target hurtling toward it at 6 kilometers per second. All this under hellish conditions, where the violent atmospheric drag was trying to tear the missile itself to pieces. And so, by 1970, the system was ready. The Western Republic had created its shield. In tests over the icy waters of the North Atlantic, Sprint missiles repeatedly found and destroyed their targets, proving that the impossible was just a complex engineering problem. While the Soviets were paralyzed by fear of unknown physics, American engineers simply took the known laws and applied them with unprecedented aggression. They didn't reinvent the wheel. They just spun it so fast that it caught fire. But Sprint was more than just a shield. Its very existence changed the psychology of the Cold War, proving that the Western Republic could find a bold, unconventional solution to a stalemate. However, the story didn't end there. The Soviets had yet to learn what Sprint truly was, and this knowledge would bring them not relief, but a completely new kind of terror. The realization that their giant, incredibly expensive offensive arsenal had become vulnerable to a flying cone of burnt quartz. The resolution was near, and it was destined to happen not on a battlefield, but in the quiet of a conference room. Geneva, Switzerland. SALT I negotiations, May 1972. The mystery of the white ghost did not vanish with a bang, but with the scratch of a fountain pen on paper. For 5 long years, the Eastern Union had lived in the shadow of the American anomaly. They had chased ghosts of lasers, nuclear pulses, and phantom physics. Billions of rubles had been thrown into the furnace, trying to understand how an object could move so fast without disintegrating into atoms. The answer finally came. Not from a spy or a defector, but from the Americans themselves. It happened during the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The Soviet delegation, led by diplomats with stone-faced expressions and watched by keen-eyed KGB handlers, sat opposite their American counterparts. The official goal was to limit nuclear arsenals, but the real game was poker. The entire Soviet strategy was built on their massive ICBMs, the R-36, nicknamed SS-9 Scarp by NATO. They were unstoppable city killers, but the Soviet generals were terrified. They knew that if the White Ghost was deployed en masse, their entire R-36 armada would become useless junk. During a technical break, an American advisor, with a barely perceptible smirk, slid a simple informational document across the polished table. It wasn't a confession. It was a brochure. It detailed the capabilities of the, quote, 110 Anti-Ballistic missile system, radar range, intercept geometry, and the specifications of the interceptor missile. They called it, quote, 111. The Soviet technical advisors, swallowing hard, devoured the data. Not a word about a nuclear engine. No hint of force fields. The diagram showed a simple 2-stage solid fuel rocket with a ridiculous conical shape. Quote 113, one of the Soviet engineers whispered in shock, reading the English text. His finger froze on a line. Quote 114, quote 115. Those 2 words fell into the silence of the room like a lead weight. The realization hit instantly, with the force of a physical blow. The Americans hadn't rewritten the laws of physics. They had simply cast aside the instinct for self-preservation. They had built a missile that survived by literally burning itself alive. They solved the guidance problem not with some supernatural artificial intelligence, but with a cynically simple solution. A ground-based computer so monstrously fast it could perform millions of calculations per second. computing power the Eastern Union could not even dream of. The shock for the Soviet command was not that such a weapon existed. The shock was in its deafening simplicity. They had made themselves believe they were fighting aliens from the future. In reality, they were up against merely more skilled chemists and microchip designers. The white ghost turned out to be just a rock, a very fast and very hot rock. In Leningrad, this revelation sparked a new wave of icy panic. The mystery was solved, but the nightmare was just beginning. Now, knowing what it was, they could calculate with terrifying accuracy what it meant. The Soviet General Staff ran simulations. Sprint accelerated to 100 G. It could intercept a warhead at an altitude of just 12 kilometers. This meant the Americans could wait until the very last moment, the final fraction of a second, until they were certain the incoming object was a real warhead and not a decoy, and only then strike. All Soviet countermeasures, decoys, chaff, inflatable mock-ups, were rendered useless overnight. Sprint didn't operate in the vacuum of space, where decoys worked perfectly. It operated in the dense layers of the atmosphere, where heavy warheads plummeted toward the Earth, while light inflatable balloons were helplessly slowed by drag. The atmosphere itself became a filter, sorting out the decoys for the Americans, while Sprint coolly finished off what remained. Colonel Morozov wrote with deadly accuracy in his final assessment. The conclusion was singular and blood-chilling. The entire Soviet nuclear deterrent had been compromised. If the Americans built enough Sprints, they could launch a first disarming strike against the Eastern Union, incinerate the Soviet silos, and then use their new shield to intercept the few miraculously surviving missiles that managed to launch in response. The balance of terror that had kept the world on the brink had collapsed. The Americans had seized the strategic high ground. Humiliated to the core, the Soviet military-industrial complex reacted as it always had. It rushed to blindly copy the enemy. The order came down directly from the Smolny. Design bureaus were ordered to immediately create an equivalent, a high-speed interceptor. The project received the index 53T6, later known to NATO as. But it was this desperate attempt to catch up that exposed the full depth of the systemic rot in the Soviet machine. They could cast the missile's airframe. They could pour solid fuel into it, but they could not weave its skin. The American process for creating quartz phenolic required industrial weaving looms and resin injection technologies that were on the verge of science fiction. The Soviet chemical industry struggled to produce stable batches of far simpler materials. But even worse, they could not create its brain. Sprint relied on its missile site radar, MSR, and its colossal computing center. The Soviets were still clinging to analog computers and bulky, primitive digital systems. When they tried to test their own interceptors, their computers simply burned out from the overload. They couldn't track both the target and the missile hurtling toward it simultaneously. The math was too fast for their processors. Eventually, the 53T6 entered service, but years late and plagued by reliability issues. It was a crude sledgehammer next to the American surgical scalpel. And to compensate for this glaring inaccuracy, Soviet engineers had to take a monstrous step. They equipped their interceptors with nuclear warheads. Consider the depth of this failure. The Americans had learned to hit a bullet with a bullet, a kinetic kill, or a tiny neutron charge. The Soviets, unable to hit the bullet, decided that for reliability, they would have to detonate the entire sky over Leningrad. They were forced to incorporate a nuclear explosion over their own capital into their defensive plans in order to save it. That was the technological difference. That was the entire gap, the technological abyss. That was how vast the gap was. And then, in late 1972, history took its most stunning turn. The Americans had created Sprint, and it worked. They were already erecting launch complexes when suddenly they extended a hand to sign the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. This treaty bound each side, allowing only 2, and later just 1, anti-ballistic missile site. It effectively put an end to the very national shield the Americans had just perfected. A stunned silence fell over the offices in the Soviet Union. Why? Why would the Americans invest billions in developing the ultimate weapon, prove its effectiveness to the world, inspire terror, and then, at the peak of their triumph, voluntarily agree to ban it? Soviet analysts frantically searched for the catch. Was Sprint actually a failure? Had its cost spiraled out of control? The real reason was a masterclass in economic warfare. The Americans had calculated several moves ahead. Yes, Sprint worked flawlessly, but deploying the system to protect the entire territory of the Western Republic would have cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Technically feasible, economically ruinous. However, by creating this technological marvel and demonstrating its capabilities, they forced the Soviets to the negotiating table. And the Soviets signed the treaty not out of a love for peace. They signed it out of fear of an arms race they now knew they could not win. Had completed its mission. It never shot down a single enemy missile in combat. It shot down Soviet self-confidence. And while the ink was still drying on the newly signed treaty in Leningrad, the engineers at Martin Marietta were already packing up their blueprints. The Sprint program began to wind down. The famous pyramid-shaped radar in Montana was deactivated just months after it reached full operational capability. For the Soviets, this was not just a defeat. It was the ultimate humiliation. The Americans had created a miracle, used it as leverage for a diplomatic victory, and then, with cold indifference, cast it aside like a disposable toy. It was a demonstration of power on a level the Cold War had never seen. But the legacy of Sprint did not vanish. The technology of lightning-fast acceleration did not fade into oblivion. It simply went into the shadows, only to be reborn later in Patriot missiles and THAAD systems. And the Soviets were left with wounded pride and archives filled with half-finished blueprints for a missile they could never quite build. A missile designed to fight a threat that had already moved far ahead. That day, they learned a harsh lesson. In the Cold War, it's not just the speed of your missiles that matters, it's the speed of your thinking. Great Falls, Montana, the present day. If you ever find yourself among the desolate wheat fields of Cascade County, you will see something that looks like the wreckage of an alien spacecraft. A concrete pyramid 10 stories high. Its top is sheared off, and on each of its 4 faces, a huge, unblinking radar eye is frozen. It stands in absolute silence, surrounded by the rusting skeletons of launch silos. This is the Stanley R. Michelson Safeguard Complex. It is the tomb of the Sprint program, and at the same time, it is the most expensive monument to a brilliant bluff in human history. The story of the, quote, 135 ends with a statistic that sends a shiver down the spine. The Western Republic spent nearly $6 billion in 1970s currency to build this complex. They created the fastest missile in history. They built the most powerful radar the world had ever seen. They trained the crews. They loaded the silos with Sprint and Spartan missiles. On October 1st, 1975, the complex was declared fully operational. 24 hours later, the United States Congress voted to shut it down. To an outside observer, this looks like an absurd, colossal waste, a bureaucratic failure of epic proportions. But for historians of the Cold War, it was the checkmate. It was the final power play. Without batting an eye, the Western Republic showed the Eastern Union, we can create the impossible, deploy it, and then simply abandon it because its maintenance is too expensive. This gesture, full of icy arrogance, sent a single message to the Smolny. The true legacy of the Sprint missile is not craters in the ground, but gaping holes in Leningrad's budget. Sprint lured the Eastern Union into a deadly game where it had no chance of winning. Before Sprint, the arms race was a crude contest of muscle, a competition of tonnage. Whose bomb is bigger? Who has more tanks? And in this game, the Soviets were masters. Endless reserves of steel, giant factories, and a planned economy that could churn out T-72 tanks by the thousands, as if on a conveyor belt. But Sprint changed the very currency of war. It shifted the focus from the brute force of heavy metal to the elegant power of silicon. To defeat Sprint, or create its counterpart, Gazelle, the Soviets needed technologies from the future. State-of-the-art microprocessors, heat-resistant composite materials, phased array radars capable of tracking hundreds of targets at once. They didn't have these technologies. They tried to steal them, tried to copy them, tried to recreate them with brute force. The Soviet response to Sprint, the 53 T-6 Gazelle missile, became a nightmare for their own budgets. It was temperamental and unstable, requiring endless maintenance. Its guidance system failed at the worst possible moments. And while the American Sprint was a sniper, a surgically precise, quote, weapon, its Soviet counterpart remained a nuclear shotgun, forcing them to incinerate their own sky to have any guarantee of an intercept. This technological gap is what broke the back of the Soviet economy. In the 1980s, when the US took the next step by announcing the, quote, program, SDI, a direct spiritual successor to Sprint, the Smolny realized a bitter truth. They were bankrupt. They simply did not have the resources to create a new generation of computing systems and keep up with American speed. They had accelerated the Cold War to such a pace that the Soviet engine simply seized. But the DNA of Sprint is alive and well. Look at modern battlefields, and you will see its descendants everywhere. The Patriot PAC-3 missile, which shoots down tactical ballistic missiles, is a child of Sprint's technology. The THAAD system is a direct heir to its intercept geometry. Israel's Iron Dome uses the same command guidance principles first perfected in that concrete pyramid in Montana. Sprint proved that kinetic interception was real. It showed that you don't need a nuclear explosion to destroy a missile. All you need is extreme speed and flawless mathematics. Thanks to it, the nightmare of the 1960s, where the only defense against nuclear apocalypse was an even larger nuclear apocalypse, gave way to the era of kinetic defense. We moved from the age of mutually assured destruction to the age of missile defense. Even the materials created for Sprint's nose cone, that white-hot quartz phenolic, found peaceful application in the heat shields of NASA space probes. The algorithms written to track warheads now organize civilian air traffic. The ghost did not disappear. It simply dissolved into the very machinery of the modern world, becoming its invisible part. A cold wind blows through the abandoned radar complex in Montana. The concrete is scarred by half a century of rain. The missile silos are welded shut. Cows graze peacefully by the fence. The place seems quiet and forgotten. But if you stand still and listen to history itself, you can hear the deafening sonic boom that once shattered the Soviet worldview. Sprint is a weapon that never fired a single shot in anger. It never saved a single city. It never intercepted a Russian warhead bound for Chicago. By all the laws of war, it accomplished nothing. But in the great poker game of the Cold War, Sprint was the ace up the sleeve. It moved so fast that it blurred the line between the present and the future, making the Eastern Union believe the Americans possessed an incomprehensible magic. It turned the very sky into an impenetrable wall. And therein lies the true power of the quote. Its enemy was not crushed by 100 Gs of acceleration. It was crushed by doubt. Looking at that shining white flash on the reconnaissance photos, the Soviets realized for the first time since 1945 that they were looking at their own hopeless obsolescence. They were looking into the face of a future they could never catch.